Welcome to today's lecture, and I'm very pleased to welcome our two speakers for tonight on behalf of the SFB Production of Migration and the Institute for Migration Studies and Intercultural Relation, Laura Zander and Peter Schneck. We are very delighted that so many of you found the way to the third floor, although there is much competition with other activities, either sitting in the sun or going to the Maiwoche. But I'm sure we will be entertained by our two colleagues very nicely, and at least they promised also to have a presentation that is not boring, and both speakers will take turns in doing their presentation. Their project they're going to present tonight is also associated since a couple of weeks or a month already to the SFB. And we're extremely happy because so far we haven't been able to include literature studies and other cultural studies to our wide range of disciplines. So we expect insights on the cultural production of migration. And we also hope to learn how you could, or how we can relate your project to the different foci of the SFB, both in terms of conceptions of production and also on our thematic clusters, figures of migration, infrastructures, and spaces. Like when we talk about literature, those who are not in the field might think it's only about fictional characters that might work as certain figures of migration. But I think as a layperson that we also can learn from you how these fictional characters move into other fields. Such as material infrastructures maybe, or politics, other arenas, the law, as these figures or literary fictional characters also inspire discourses and become part of societal discourses around migration. And not only figures, but myself working also on irregular migration and crisis of migration. I found it very impressive how certain novels became very much cited in the political sphere, for example, in France, and certain images like that societies cannot cope with more and more migrants coming to France, or with poverty migration. So I think that literature is a very interesting field to study for all migration researchers. So we're very much looking forward to your presentation tonight. To briefly introduce our two speakers, Peter Schneck is a professor of American literature, American studies here at Osnabrück University, and also a member of the Migration Studies Institute and the SFB. And his research focuses on several centuries of literature up to today, I think, up to very current literary productions, and the relationship between law and literature, and literary fiction and human rights. And so that's also the field you're going to present today. Laura Zander, she's a postdoctoral researcher, also here in the Department for English and American Studies, also a member of the SFB, and holds a degree, holds many degrees. It's very difficult and very impressive because you hold a degree in English, literature and linguistics, and both state examinations in law. So that's quite an unusual combination and makes you a perfect researcher for the field you study. And her research also, or both of you work on post-colonial approaches in literature studies and post-colonial studies and African and Caribbean literatures. And I also saw that you teach two very interesting courses this semester. I think one on post as present is very much related to this seminar, South African literature. And the other one is on artificial intelligence in the study of literature. So we're looking forward to your presentation, which will last for about 45, 50 minutes. And then we open the floor for the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, for this wonderful introduction. I'm not so sure about the entertainment value, about what you're going to hear. I wanted to thank Andreas and everyone else from the SFB to give us the opportunity to actually present our project, find ourselves a little bit embarrassed. It's an embarrassment of riches, of course, obviously, because we are asked to present a project, but we also want to make an argument about the project, an argument that hopefully will lead to a discussion in what way our project can be linked to the larger SFB context. So this will be a dialogue, or rather a dialogical back and forth between me and Laura, because we have several parts. And we can right away, I'm not sure about the 45 minutes. If I go into Bozzetti mode, you have to stop me. You have to say, slow, please. So I tend to try to read fast. So it is perhaps more than just a form of professional courtesy to contextualize our talk today more than is usual at these SFB events, and most of all in regard to the original development of our project in the context of another interdisciplinary collaborative research center, the SFB 1385, Recht und Literatur, Law and Literature, at the University of Münster between 2019 and 2024. Now, law and literature is a field of interdisciplinary research that is well known and established in Anglo-American scholarship between law and the humanities, but much less so in Germany. And moreover, with regard to the more immediate context of this SFB, the production of migration, the law and literature angle of our project might not immediately appear plausible or even convincing. However, when we developed this project together with our Münster colleagues from the law faculty, in particular Nora Markert, Chair of International Public Law and Human Rights, the highly contested and debated connex between migration and human rights formed the core research focus for both the legal and the literary studies perspective. What successfully helped us to integrate our respective disciplinary perspectives was our shared interest in the central question and debate about migrants as subjects of rights, and more specifically as subjects of human rights, whose recognition and treatment, but also whose self-understanding as rights-bearing subjects in regard to international and universal principles of law very much depends on the way in which this subject is continually constructed and reconstructed in the legal, political, and cultural narratives about migrancy, both in the national and on a global scale. Narratives of migrancy, that's our focus, thus form the distinctive discursive wrapping of a universal phenomenon, people on the move. And with the help of these narrative wrappings, people on the move are turned into subjects, a process which the social philosopher Thomas Nail has described as a process of cultural legal formation of the migrant as a signature figure of our time.
Since the early modern period, the law has been crucial in defining the legitimacy of movement across and settlement within territorial borders, thus creating various legal figurations of subjects on the move, for example, the vagrant, the refugee, the nomad, the guest worker, and the asylum seeker. As social philosopher Thomas Nail has argued, these examples may be looked at as specific historical and cultural variants of the central figure of human mobility, the figure of the migrant. While not all migrants are alike in their movement, Nail points out, they all share the experience that their movement results in a certain degree of expulsion from their territorial, political, juridical, and economic status. Given the ubiquity and universal quality of the migrants' experience of movement as expulsion from status, we will address this experience less as a particular and merely passing moment within the general process and thus narrative of migration. Rather, we will look at the experience of movement as a continuum, or even a state of existence which all migrants share, the state of migrancy. The most obvious expulsion from status in relation to migrancy, we argue, is the change in juridical or legal status experienced by the migrant, that is, the loss or lack or even denial of rights. In this respect, migrancy as a state of existence marks all people on the move as transitory legal subjects hovering, as it were, between the spheres of national and international law, between civil and human rights, between citizen and alien. The continuing legal reformation of legitimate and illegitimate migration not only informs dominant political narratives and cultural metaphors about the figure of the migrant, it also shapes the ideological imaginaries of migrancy in our age of exhilarated globalization. Migration as a global phenomenon is thus not just the result of international statistics of mobility and the transnational transfer and counter-transfer of conceptual debates about migration policies and border control. It is also constructed and affirmed by globalized narratives of migration, which are produced by and circulated in global media and communication networks, as well as globally distributed cultural and artistic forms of representation, including literature, film, and television series. Indeed, migrancy has become a global story space. As Mr. Garcia Canclini has emphasized from a South American hemispheric perspective, the fundamentally ambivalent nature of globalization in regard to migration is most of all reflected in the conflict between official and dominant imaginaries on the one hand, and the counter-imaginaries informed by the voices and experience of migrants themselves, stretching across a broad range of sources and forms, including autobiographical documentaries, but also literary fictions, visual representations, and artworks. With respect to the role of law in the formation of legal subjects on the move, this conflict between different imaginaries and figurations has become most prominent and resonant in the field of human rights. Provocatively speaking, over the last 2 decades, the figure of the migrant has become the central imaginary figuration of the subject of human rights precisely because the universal acknowledgement of migrancy as a human rights issue has been lacking and inconsequential. As a central UN document stated as early as 2001, international and national efforts to defend human rights of migrants and combat xenophobia remain scattered, fragmented, and relatively limited in impact. And unfortunately, this has not changed much in the almost 25 years since. In a manner of speaking, the migrant is overdetermined in terms of political and cultural presence and salience, and thoroughly underdetermined in terms of legal status or subjectivation, that is, in terms of universal rights. More current international debates on migration and human rights have, however, demonstrated a growing tendency to move away from conventional normative categories such as travelers, tourists, visitors, migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, and repeat border offenders. As Elspeth Guild has suggested, this may be an attempt to describe the cross-border movement of people in a consistent manner, which is not tainted by normative constructions which are created by imputing intentions to people moving. If all cross-border travelers are described in the same manner, that is to say, as migrants, Guild maintains, the term migrant may lose its stigma as a term to describe only unwanted aliens. During the same time, and parallel to these trends, a global literature of migration has emerged and fairly established itself as an important medium and voice within a larger context of human rights and literature. Especially in its Anglo-American forms and genres, and thereby global distribution, it has been used effectively to present strong arguments for the necessity of more universal formations of the legal status and acknowledgement of migrants as subjects of human rights. These novels by authors from diverse cultural backgrounds and geographical regions clearly attempt to transcend national boundaries as they share a crucial interest in finding specific literary answers to Jacques Rancière's famous and challenging question, who is the subject of the rights of man? Such global fictions of migrancy illustrate how subjects on the move are imagined and imposed by divergent legal and literary narratives of migration. These texts, for the most part, focus on real conditions and forms of experience in specific regions and locales. Yet they also share and express an acute awareness of the transnational universal dimension of the experience and the realities they observe and register. The emerging textuality of a global literature of human rights and migration emphatically links the universality of human rights and the global scale of injustice towards migrants to literature as a universal form of political rhetoric and medium of social justice. Migrancy fictions, we thus argue, negotiate the contradictions and conflicts inherent in the legal formation of the migrant and reflect on how literary forms and narrative modes may present and suggest alternative visions of migrant subjectivity and agency.
The crucial significance and at the same time limited effectiveness of human rights is perhaps most visible in the context of the global mobility of individuals and groups, whether through flight, displacement, or migration. Being nothing but human and thus legally reduced to the mere possession of human rights only seems to affirm that the dignity and freedom of the subject on the move can ultimately only be guaranteed by civic rights, as Hannah Arendt once feared. On the one hand, every human being enjoys a right to mobility, as the right to emigrate and return freely to his or home nation state, irrespective of nationality, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states. The right of access to another state, however, is inseparably linked to citizenship. It is the one legal means that enable the exercise of the human right to mobility. A point increasingly acknowledged in recent scholarship, for instance in Ayelet Shah's study The Birthright Lottery, or even in the public outreach effort, such as The Power of the Visa, which we all watched last week. There's thus a painful tension between an ideal, global, and universal claim to the validity of human rights and a geographically and personally limited legal reality, legal applicability, and legal enforceability of human rights. Bearing various implications with regard to inclusion as well as exclusion, citizenship clearly appears to essentially constitute perceptions of selfhood and otherness, but quite ironically also seems to be the only legal means to practically enforce or claim human rights, even if the enforcement of human rights should, in theory at least, depend on nothing more than the notion of a shared humanity. While globalization has been exerting constantly increasing strains on conventional notions of citizenship and challenging traditional or homogeneous perception of national cultures, obviously there's a backlash now, national borders remain very much in effect, and they're even re-strengthened and militarized. Even though alternatives to territorial conceptions of citizenship have been suggested over the past, such as cultural, multicultural, or transnational forms of citizenships, or the extension of municipal citizenship rights for local non-national residents, citizenship remains one of the principal factors of the enforceability of rights in general and human rights in general and in human rights in particular. Citizenship and migration are, of course, linked, but they obviously also share a history of mutual formation. What was notoriously misconstrued in 2015 as a global refugee crisis has put renewed pressure on the ongoing debate about humanism, collective responsibility, and the feasibility of a hospitable society. The subsequent tension of conflict and intolerance contest a new and increasingly dynamic perception of citizenship. Undoubtedly, the forging of a communal spirit necessarily seems to evolve the forging of exclusion. Consequently, exclusion becomes one of the main functions of citizenship. It's a form of belonging or non-belonging. Notions of citizenship and belonging have therefore not only encompassed privilege, but have become fortified legally by creating legal instruments for discrimination against non-citizens. In fact, not only does citizenship appear to establish a reciprocal relationship of duties and responsibilities between state and citizen, but citizenship as a fundamental human right grants nothing less than the rights to have rights. The glaring discrepancy between ideal and reality in human rights discourse is reminiscent or reminds us of Hannah Arendt's skepticism about the concept itself, the concept of human rights. In theory, these should be enjoyed by every human being by virtue of his or her mere existence, but in fact, as Arendt feared in her 1951 The Origins of Totalitarianism, which still applies today, human rights can, and all too often will, only be claimed by those who are also citizens.
The fate of the precarious subject on the move is profoundly shaped by global cultural and political imaginaries, whether articulated by individuals, political actors, or the media, which influence how migration is represented, understood, and governed across different contexts. This dynamic is evident from the widely used misnomer of a global migration crisis, which casts migrants as a threat, while obscuring the fact that the real crisis is one of forced dispossession, deprivation, and displacement, conditions largely produced by and advantage to the Western world. Such narratives present the negative consequences of migration as objective facts, while simultaneously framing much of global mobility through the criminalizing lens of illegality. Catherine Dauvergne maintains, however, that illegal migration is a product of migration law. Ultimately, it is through deliberate legal frameworks and prohibitions that certain forms of movement are rendered illegal. It is through such imaginaries that refugees as well as migrants are cast as cultural outsiders in shallow and essentializing multicultural discourses, becoming focal points of dog whistle politics that invoke terms like illegals, too many immigrants, unauthorized arrival, and asylum seekers, buzzwords routinely used to legitimize increasingly racist migration controls. Harsha Valya highlights the irony of a situation in which the migration crisis is declared a new crisis, with Western countries positioned as its victims, even though for 4 centuries, nearly 80 million Europeans became settler colonists across the Americas and Oceania, while 4 million indentured laborers from Asia were scattered across the globe, and the transatlantic slave trade kidnapped and enslaved 15 million Africans. Colonialism, genocide, slavery, and indentureship are not only conveniently erased as continuities of violence and current invocations of a migration crisis, but are also the very conditions of possibility for the West's preciously guarded imperial sovereignty. A politics of fear functions as convenient cover for a visible double standard. And a pandemic, like every global crisis before it, provided a perfect excuse to hasten the vision of securitized borders and usher states of emergency into permanency, a politics which today almost all European parties and governments have increasingly subscribed to under the pressure of far-right and populist movements. As countries continue to open its borders to capital, militaries, and commodities such as diamonds, oil, uranium, coltan, hard borders restrict the mobility of impoverished, racialized people. The bleak reality is that 1 out of every 4 people attempting to enter Europe by boat dies en route, yet movements of Africans are imagined, and I quote Vallier again, as insects, swarms, vectors of diseases, familiar narratives of danger and disaster, unquote. Such victim-blaming responses to border deaths put responsibility on people for choosing to make unsafe journeys, while it is restrictive policies that compel irregular migration in the first place. What these narratives fail to acknowledge is that border restrictions create conditions rife for exploitation. The economy for extorting traffickers would, however, collapse if there were no border controls. In such a vein, Bridget Anderson argues that through anti-trafficking legislation and a language of harm, the state emerges as the protector of victims, even though state practices are the primary force in constructing this very vulnerability. Glossing over structural responsibility and restitution, the social grammar of benevolence maintains, as Ida Danovic argues, a colonial and patronizing fantasy of the white man's burden, which ultimately does little to challenge established interpretations that see the West as the bastion of democracy, liberty, and universal rights.
Okay, and what does the relation of law and literature have to do with all of this? In the context of human rights, the reciprocal relationship between law and literature presents itself as particularly striking, if not extraordinary. Not only have the ideal humanity and the real inhumanity of law always been central themes of its literary representation, negotiation, and dramatization since antique drama, but moreover, the now self-evident conviction that human beings have universal rights whose recognition and protection they can claim and demand has been able to develop and assert itself very essentially with the help of literary forms and narratives. In this respect, literary texts and narrative forms were central and even causal for the emergence of a specific modern understanding, a sense and understanding of human legal subjectivity, just as law has shaped a particular canon of literary text characterized by specific narrative forms and concrete effects. The interaction of law and literature in the course of historical and current human rights debates is, according to the central thesis of our research project, not merely corrective or complementary or critical, but constitutive. The law seeks, at least ideally, to constitute a reliable authority, a system that offers solutions to practical questions and provides a fixed yet sufficiently flexible structure that order and manages the position of the subject of law vis-à-vis the state as well as other legal subjects. That this ideal is not always executed in the real world or realized in the real world, especially in the context of human rights, has already become evident. Literature, as criticism in contrast, does not even attempt such a fixation, but, to quote Martin Kamen, moves quite deliberately in, quote, the realm of ambiguity, paradox, provisionality, aporia, and postponement, not that of definite judgments and propositions, unquote. While the law seeks to provide a reliable set of rules, literature allows for the questioning and renegotiating of the complexity and opacity of the same relationships in the first place. Again, ideally, literature enables a transcendence of personal experience and explores states of mind beyond individual moral codes and predetermined legal categories. As Lynn Hunt, Richard Rorty, and Martha Nussbaum, among others, have asserted, literary texts provide intense and effective forms of empathy, and thus may facilitate ethical and emotional subject formation and education. However, at the same time, literature should by no means be superficially misconstrued to warrant empathy by default. For one thing, literature can just as well be instrumentalized for the inscription of discriminatory or hierarchical power structures. Moreover, feelings of empathy are not automatically or necessarily translated into political action through reading. Accordingly, Sophia McLennan and Joseph Slaughter conceded that, quote, as often as cultural forms make human suffering visible, they distort perceptions in ways that make it possible to disenfranchise and abuse others. Contrary to elitist Western humanist expectations, literature is not always helpful in order to imagine others, and often serves to underscore national, ethnic divisions. In such a vein, in her 2019 essay on the banality of empathy, Namrali Serpil cautions that the empathy model of art can bleed too easily into the relishing of suffering by those who are safe from it. Accordingly, she labels the empathy model a gateway drug to white saviorism, with its familiar blend of propaganda, pornography, and paternalism. It's an emotional palliative that distracts us from real inequities on the page and on screen, to say nothing of our actual lives. And it has imposed upon readers and viewers the idea that they can and ought to use art to inhabit others, especially the marginalized. This is, of course, heavy criticism. I think that literature itself has tried to find ways to move around that. In a similar vein, but with a different accent, Lindsay Stonebridge cautions that the way in which literature is world-making, more often than not, shapes the world in the interest of the powerful, or its audiences. And for this very reason, greater suspicion of naive, banal, or excessive expectations of literature might be necessary. However, to portray literature as the cultural wing of a politically impotent humanism, Stonebridge argues, is to disparage both human rights and literary writing, which can provide powerful and sometimes effective ideas and practices and alternative forms of imagining, of being moral and political in the world. Ultimately, what is at stake is literature's subversive or changing power, meaning whether literature might be able to induce political awareness and change, for instance, by generating empathy and enabling moral judgments through reading processes, or whether it ultimately, albeit perhaps unintentionally, affirms established literary and political hierarchies. The discrepancy between legitimization through law and de facto injustice becomes particularly clear in contrast with literature which demands and might potentially even bring about not simply empathy or compassion, but solidarity, and act as a powerful advocate for effective implementation of human rights law and policies. And perhaps at the same time, literature might also be able to bridge the discrepancy between the commitment to common legal principles and the respective national migration policies and regimes.
And here we come to our project in a more detailed fashion. All of what was said before is basically the background, and now we're turning to our actual argument. The focus of our research is on the question, or rather the possibility, of emergent and alternative human rights subjects that can be described in their dependence on, but also in contrast to, and maybe even in resistance to, conventional, that is, explicitly codified or implicitly projected subjects in law and contemporary literature on flight, displacement, and migration. Both in the global fictions of human rights in literature, but also in the narrative practices of migrating people, linguistic and textual strategies can be discerned from this perspective by which subjectivity can, or even demands to be, negotiated before the law and at the same time inscribed into the law. Due to their global dissemination and networking, these alternative forms of subjectivation form global narratives and literatures, since the idea of universal human rights has simultaneously promoted and still maintains the claim of a universal global human rights literature or human rights fictions. This literature in turn maintains and advances the global claim to validity of specific legal subjectivities. Our project aims to examine this new global emergence of a world literature of human rights from three correlating perspectives, integrating critical legal and literary studies. These perspectives address different but related aspects. First of all, the narratability and the right to speak. Secondly, narrative capability and empowerment. And last but not least, kinopolitics and kinopoetics. And I will go into much more detail about all three of these points now. The inherent connection between narratability and subjectification plays an important role in the subject critique of post-colonial theory formation, as well as in critical human rights studies, and it also overlaps with cultural studies and critical migration studies. This provides rich impulses for legal and literary research. We have identified 3 points of intersection that may be highlighted as resonating strongly with the basic assumption about narrative subjectification in the context of human rights. I will begin with the first. The emphasis on how human rights subjects are formed and rendered narratable is complemented by an equally important argument that human rights themselves are fundamentally shaped through language and rhetoric. In this view, human rights provide a space for discursive self-determination and empowerment in relation to the law. The subject that emerges here is dialogic, capable of contradiction and response. That ties back to Lyotard. Within the space of the right to speak, and of course that goes back to Fisman, opened up by human rights, the legal subject can appear as a genuinely political subject. This idea is further developed by Jacques Rancière, who expands on Althusser's and Foucault's models of subjectification through a political aesthetic theory of the subject. His approach enables a productive dialogue between legal and literary criticism, particularly through his concept of the senses, the disruption of dominant narratives that define what can be seen and said, and of course ultimately also thought. Rancière's notion of radical equality and the open-ended formation of subjectivity is especially useful for exploring alternative subject formations and their expression in both imaginary and practical terms. Additionally, Rancière's analysis of rights and his insights into the politics of literature, especially the shared act of reading, are valuable for thinking about literature within broader contexts of activism and artistic practice. While this context often extends beyond literature in the strict sense, it remains tied to it as a form of storytelling and narrative intervention. Secondly, another important link between interdisciplinary research and narrative theory is found in Amartya Sen's capability approach, especially in its extension and integration into a narratological ethical framework by Paul Ricoeur. This extension offers a more productive framework for a critical and comparative narrative theory than Martha Nussbaum's version of the capability approach, even though hers is also based on sense work. For Ricoeur, a key point is that the right to narrate includes not just the capacity to tell one's story, but also the recognition of that capacity by others, the legitimacy of one's claim to narration. Framed this way, narrative capability places greater emphasis on the legal subject's narrative self-empowerment. In both literature and law, this implies that the subject's agency lies not only in being represented or narrated by others, but also in the ability to actively shape the narrative form. Thus, the subject is not merely subjected, passively formed by discourse, but actively inscribed in form, what Ricoeur and others refer to as subjectivation. Taken together, Sen's and Ricoeur's approaches, alongside Rancière's reflections on the human rights subject, provide an effective conceptual and methodological framework for exploring the link between subject formation and narrative agency. This framework also allows us to analyze literary forms where they are taken up and strategically used by migrating subjects themselves as acts of active inscription into discursive and aesthetic orders. In a similar way, human rights law can be strategically engaged from within, explored by our collaborative and complementary project on legal subjectivity and human rights discourse conducted by Nora Market and her team at Münster University. And thirdly, in the resonance space of critical reflexive migration research, which is of particular importance for the present project, Thomas Nail's work on global migration as kinopolitics offers an extremely productive interdisciplinary connection as well. For the conceptualization of migrancy, which addresses and makes visible the experiences, practices, and agency of migrating people in their mobility and movements, his reflections on the figure of the migrant as the current dominant legal cultural figuration of the political subject are an essential reference point for the literary negotiation of migrating subjects and their experiences. Nail's observation that in the political aesthetic representation of subjects on the move, the crossing of political borders always links up with the transgression and mixing of aesthetic orders, challenges kinopolitics with kinopoetics, and clearly correlates with Rancière's statements about the distribution and disruption of the visible as a political constitution and revision of the sensory order, or partage du sensible, in Rancière's words. So, after this very dense theoretical run-through, we try to compress it all into a very limited space. Let's turn to our literary corpus, which might be the more entertaining bit, hopefully. This is, of course, just a selection. From this interdisciplinary perspective, one can easily identify a wide range of fictional, non-fictional, and hybrid texts which have acquired considerable attention in this respect, ranging from Ana Castillo's The Guardians to Luis Alberto Urrea's The Devil's Highway, from Valeria Luiselli's The Lost Children's Archive to John Washington's The Dispossessed. Those are all on Peter's field. Beres Bocciani's No Friend But a Mountain to Dina Nayeri's The Ungrateful Refugee. The limited scope of our talk does not allow us to present more than just a very small sample, that means two, of the diverse texts and projects which provide the basic material for our research. However, focusing in more detail on two particular interesting projects will hopefully provide at least some insight into what we propose as emergent genres of migrancy narratives. Our first example, The Refugee Tales, is a project in the UK which has been ongoing since 2015 and is still continuing, and which decidedly pushes the border between migrant literature and literary activism. Indeed, it can be understood as a new kind of political aesthetic aiming to change the politics of immigration detention in Britain. And as you're probably all aware, even if it has been ongoing for 10 years, it hasn't managed to change much of these policies so far. Over a period of 10 years, the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group has organized solidarity walks with refugees, asylum seekers, and immigration detainees, and has so far published 5 volumes of refugee tales. Written by acclaimed writers and poets, the latter 3 volumes also contain contributions by various detainees and asylees themselves. So initially, they asked well-established writers to listen to the stories and retell them, to protect the people telling the stories, but also, of course, to ensure that they would even be able to tell their very traumatic experiences. In this way, in addition to archiving the stories in the 5 volumes, the project has been able to overcome some of the physical limitations imposed on refugees in the United Kingdom by indefinite detention in immigration removal centers, not only by allowing them to move through space by walking, but also by providing a stage for many of those affected and involved to tell their stories and to perform their otherwise silent suffering on the occasion of these walks. Since most of the contributions were not written by the refugees whose experiences are depicted but are the product of a collaboration between British-based writers and the refugees' testimony, they form a generic hybrid between life writing and fiction, between autobiography and activism, which explicitly or implicitly addresses the narrative potential and narratability of migration experiences. The Refugee Tales Outreach Initiative has continuously sought to facilitate political change by rewriting the public discourse on the so-called refugee crisis. While media portrayal in the UK, as well as conservative and right-wing political forces, have persistently attempted, and more often than not, unfortunately succeeded, in portraying incoming migrants and asylees as a threat to be contained, the refugee tales individualize and potentially rehumanize the respective individual experiences of various subjects on the move who have arrived in the UK.
Our second example is taken from rather very different context, the US-American-Mexican border. The highly unique works of Mexican author Yuri Herrera are actually a challenge for the particular corpus of texts and writings which has emerged over the past decades as a specific Anglophone American literature on migration and human rights situated at the border fiction as the genre has been characterized. First of all, Herrera writes in Spanish, and a particular version of Spanish to boot, which despite its complex aesthetic composition is clearly tied to a particular locale and region, the Mexican side of the US-Mexican border, easily recognized as El Paso or Nogales, depending on the individual narrative. Yet Herrera lives and writes in the US, and his audience is obviously Anglophone. Whether he is a Mexican author or a Mexican-American author or an American author is still a debate. He calls himself a global author. It makes a difference, of course, in the contested field of border fiction. A closer look at the various ways in which Herrera has established and received greater acknowledgement as a truly global writer and thinker, critic, and intellectual reveals some very obvious and characteristic traits of this particular type of migrancy literature, including its political claims, its writing strategies, and its aesthetic aspirations. As a contemporary Mexican author writing in Spanish from the US, from within an academic context, Herrera has been initially tagged as obscure and unknown as a Mexican writer, from the perspective of conventional national canons of literature. This, however, has changed dramatically with the English translation and publication of Herrera's so-called narco trilogy, Trabajos del Reino, Señales que Precederán al Fin del Mundo, and La Transmigración de los Cuerpos, all translated into English by Lisa Dillman, entitled respectively Kingdom, Cons, Signs Preceding the End of the World, and the Transmigration of Bodies. And these are all collaborations between Herrera and Dillman. Indeed, the English publication of the 3 novels in one volume, originally written over the course of almost 10 years, uses a rather catchy celebratory blurb quote, effectively declaring Herrera the greatest contemporary Mexican novelist. And this is part of the politic of this globalization of literature. However, unlike Ana Castillo, for instance, or Alberto Luis Urrea, 2 other well-known and highly praised border fiction authors, also contributing to the particular type of human rights literature, Herrera offers a much more radical literary approach in revising existing genre versions of border fiction and migrancy narratives and expanding them into a truly universal and global form. As many critics have noted, Herrera's peculiar mixture of Mayan myths and legends, Dante's Divina Commedia, archaic phrases and references to Moro-Arabic medieval poetry, regional border vernacular, and narco slang, pose a clear challenge to a clear-cut genre-typical reception of a narco-narrativa. On the one hand, the peculiar mixture foregrounds the poetical and aesthetic dimension of an obviously highly artful and consciously constructed language, the linguistic encoding of migrancy, as it were. On the other hand, the language also serves as the foundation for the novel's unique translation of the particular form of experience and the practices connected to that experience. In the novel, this language is described as the language of migrancy. It's the language of not simply migration or migrant experience, but rather being in border migrancy, a life form with its particular language. A state of existence which is constantly defined by paradoxical movements and moving borders, as in the famous Chicana chant, "We did not cross the border crossed us." The borders in Herrera's case, however, are not limited to existing territorial, legal and cultural regimes. They also mark the shifting lines between the real and the mythical, between mimesis and allegory, between actual experience and symbolic meaning. Herrera's textual crossings thus affirm what Thomas Nail has observed about migrant art as operating within, quote, the dialectics between political borders and aesthetic orders.
To conclude, while literature's specific interest and impassionate investment in human rights is of long standing, and the refugee, the migrant, the displaced and persecuted person have been central characters in the novel's essential involvement with justice and rights, there has been a noticeable increase in the literary representation of migrants, refugees, and displaced persons in the last 3 decades. Such fictions of migrancy, above all, elevate individualized narratives of injustice and suffering into a global and at the same time universal genre. The figure of the migrant, as Thomas Nail has insisted, echoing Salman Rushdie's earlier famous claim, has become the signature subject of a global littérature engagée of our times. But Rancière's question still remains precisely, who is the subject of this newly emerged human rights literature? In this respect, the global fictions of migrancy offer distinct but not altogether different answers. In many of these works, such as The Refugee Tales or Yuri Herrera's Border Trilogy, narratability and narrative agency are emphatically shaped and claimed by subjects on the move. Their self-determined fictions of migrancy do not simply give voice to the voiceless or offer a forum to claim the Rederecht, the right to speak of universal rights. In contrast and resistance to the conventions of a literature of suffering, these fictions of migrancy rather insist on a humanity that is neither fully defined by legal categories and subjectivities nor dependent on the victimization stereotypes of human rights activism. Thank you. And before we hand over to you, we have 2 more slides, which are not entirely which are basically the admin part to this project.
These are the actually 5 projects that were in the project which we planned together with Nora Markert and Pia Storff and Fabian Endermann. And as you can see, 5 projects linked together as a Teilprojekt in a SFB. So that's basically the emergent structure, and then we had to simply turn these 5 into 2 correlated subjects in Münster.
I mean, perhaps just to make that clear, the SFB in Münster wasn't renewed, and so we had to...
Yes.
It was supposed to mean...
Our project survived, but the SFB did not survive, unfortunately, but fortunately maybe. Also. Better than the other way around. Yes, that's true. That's perfectly true. And also, since you might be asking yourself, how are we going to work this in a global environment? Of course, there's a huge network which we have established over the last 3 years, working together with various colleagues all over the world, in Berkeley, in the Netherlands, in Hong Kong, in Costa Rica, and in South Africa. So, because this is a global thing, you have to do it in this way. Well, thank you.
Thank you.